Welcome to the Northern Ontario Mining Showcase podcast. It's a limited series for the Echo Community Podcast Network by Story Studio Network and Clark Communications. We highlight the influential voices, partners, and leaders who are driving innovation, research, and development, creating new market opportunities and new ways of doing business in the mining industry.
Justin Alexander, I work for Creative Fire, and I'm a ESG Reconciliation Action Plan and Sustainability Consultant.
A lot to unpack in that title alone, and I was talking earlier to Brandon about the incorporating this theme, this conversation of truth and reconciliation into fill in the blank, and in this case it's mining, whether it's the use of natural resources or how we, just do business in general.
Definitely.
And my guess is that a lot of people are going to look at you and say, well, why would we be talking about truth and reconciliation in a place like this?
The truth is that all the mining happens up north in everyone's communities, but all the money is spent down south, and there's no equality or equity in that, and that's a big important to bring them to the table for truth and reconciliation.
Part of the issue that we get into when we start talking about Indigenous territorial lands and so on is this question of ownership and how important it is for ownership, the Indigenous community, to have a stake in ownership in the industry itself and so on. How vital is that in terms of business development and relating it to that whole effort for truth and reconciliation? Because you really can't have one without the other, can you?
Definitely. The truth is it's not just about land back and making up for the historical past. It's that the previous history is affecting us today, and true reconciliation will also include economic reconciliation, cultural reconciliation, and that is definitely things that are involved with the mining industry as well.
Where do you find the most receptive ears to that message? Who's most receptive to it?
Well, a lot of companies say that they're very receptive to it, and a big thing that we do at Creative Fire is we have them, they take part in reconciliation action plans, and that's to help them formally or publicly commit to reconciliation. So, while it might be a social grab, we do hope that it actually is not more than virtue signaling from these companies that are here today.
Who's doing it right? Who is out there that's a champion for this?
I would say one of our best clients right now would be Agnico Eagle Mines that are here today. We have Nutrien, and Scotiabank is another one as well. So kind of everywhere, all different industries, and they're definitely big champions and big companies that have a big part within this country as well.
So what sets them apart as a leader in that area?
I would say that right now, reconciliation action plans are not a mandatory or regulation, and it's more that they're kind of coming out first and doing it just because they believe that it's true and not because they have to. Yeah.
Commitment as opposed to compliance.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the origin story of the firm itself is kind of interesting when we think about where we are with this country and truth and reconciliation. And quite frankly, most people, if I asked them out on the street today, they'd think about truth and reconciliation being something that was talked about maybe 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it's, that the whole origin story, generally speaking, is centuries old. But when we talk about your origin story as far as this is concerned, there's a personal story.
Yeah, there definitely is. And, a big reason why truth and reconciliation is a big thing now is all the graves that they found for the residential schools. But while that is a huge deal, another thing that's not talked about a lot is the 60s scoop, which happened shortly after the residential schools. And that's kind of the next phase where instead of putting them in schools, they would take them away from their original families and give them to a white family that was better, where they were abused and things like that. And that's what happened to my mother. And she went to a white family, left home, and went to the streets and things like that. And I'm a product of her from the streets, and that's carried on down. That's kind of that generational trauma, and a lot of people think it's a very dramatic thing, but it's a lot of small things. Like I was a student and I didn't have a family. I couldn't get a loan. I didn't have any parents. Government funding, I had to prove that I didn't have parents, and there's lots of hurdles that would keep me from pursuing education, and it's not something that just faces me, but it's everyone else as well.
Yeah, it's one of those chapters that aren't being told or articulated, if at all, because we're thinking of truth and reconciliation vis-a-vis the residential school. The 60s scoop is something else again, as traumatic as it is. But your story is even further buried in that respect in terms of the pecking order of the storytelling. how do we better tell your story? I mean, that's generational impact is important.
Definitely. Well, the biggest thing about truth and reconciliation is that it's not about us talking, it's about us listening to the elders, to the survivors, to Indigenous people now, because just to better understand the intergenerational trauma. And as a company, Creative Fire, that's what we do, is we listen to these communities, we go to the communities, we build the relationships, and we ask what they want, what they believe is right and wrong. And that's the true way to achieve reconciliation, is to listen, and then we can act on it together.
And what's important is to understand that each one of those communities has a different story. It requires a different level and a different kind of listening.
Absolutely. And the biggest thing, too, is that we use terms like Indigenous or Aboriginal, and they used to say Indian. And the issue is that we're all just making them like a singular community. But the truth is that all the cultures, they're very different. They have different languages, different rituals. And if we treat them as one culture, it's no better than calling them Indian as we used to back then.
They each have their own way of culture in terms of the history, too, is what's important, right?
Yes.
I mean, and that's a harder thing for the Western culture to understand and get their head around, perhaps maybe even so than the residential schools, because we can put a pin in a map and say this is where it happened and this is when it happened. But to talk about it in 600 different ways based on the number of communities across the country there are, that's a challenge in terms of breaking open that conversation, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it's just easier to control people when it's a singular type of person, and it's a lot harder to understand that it's all unique and they're all very different cultures, and Canada's been doing that for a long time. And that's why we have them under the federal government instead of their own municipal style governments. We just call them Indigenous, and we call it a day after that. So,
thanks for doing this.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Northern Ontario Mining Showcase podcast. The series is produced for the Echo Community Podcast Network by Story Studio Network and Clark Communications. For more information, visit our website, northbayecho.ca.